I was returning from the attorney's office when I realized how heavy my life had become. The papers in my bag felt lighter than the weight in my chest. The sky was gray that afternoon, the kind of gray that makes everything feel slower, quieter, more serious. I walked carefully, my steps measured, my thoughts tangled in fear and exhaustion. At my age, even short journeys feel long, but this one felt endless, not because of distance but because of what awaited me at home. I never imagined that I would need legal advice at this stage of my life. I had spent decades believing that love, sacrifice, and patience were enough to protect a mother. That belief followed me into old age. Even as my body weakened and my world grew smaller, I trusted that the family I built would be my shelter. I was wrong. As I reached the front door, I paused for a moment, gathering my strength. The house was quiet, but it was not peaceful. Silence in that place had learned how to threaten me. I held my breath before stepping inside, as if preparing for something unseen. That fear was not sudden. It had been growing for months, quietly, patiently, until it became part of me. Once inside, I placed my bag down gently, careful not to make noise. I had learned how to move like a shadow in my own home. I had learned when to speak and, more importantly, when not to. I was no longer living, I was surviving. Each day felt like a test of endurance, and I never knew what would cause the next wave of tension. I went to my room and sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the wall. My hands trembled slightly as I opened the bag and looked at the documents. Words like rights, safety, and options stared back at me. Words I never thought I would need. I felt ashamed for even being there earlier, as if protecting myself was some kind of betrayal. That shame was deeply rooted, planted by years of being told, directly and indirectly, that a mother's role is to endure, not to complain. Memories flooded my mind. I remembered the years when this house was filled with laughter, when my children needed me for everything. I remembered how proud I was, how strong I felt. I gave my time, my health, my youth, without hesitation. I never kept count. Love doesn't count, I believed. But love should not hurt like this. I heard voices in the distance, footsteps moving through the house. My heart raced. Every sound felt louder than it should have been. I stayed still, waiting, listening. This constant alertness had become normal for me. Fear had quietly trained my body to be ready for anything, even nothing. As I sat there, a painful truth began to settle in. I was no longer safe, not emotionally, not mentally, and not physically. The attorney's words echoed in my mind, warning me gently, respectfully, as if afraid to scare me. But the fear was already there. It had been living with me long before that meeting. That was the moment I understood something terrifying. I had waited too long to protect myself, and whatever happened next would change my life forever. The days following my visit to the attorney were filled with a quiet tension that never seemed to leave my body. Even when nothing was happening, my heart stayed alert, as if it knew danger did not always announce itself loudly. I moved through the house carefully, measuring each step, choosing my words before I spoke, if I spoke at all. Fear had become a habit, something I carried with me from room to room. I hated that it felt normal, but after so long my body no longer remembered what peace felt like. I began noticing how much I had changed. Once I used to speak freely, laugh openly, and fill spaces with warmth. Now I avoided eye contact, kept my voice low, and stayed in my room as much as possible. It wasn't comfort that kept me there, it was safety. My room was the only place where I felt invisible, and invisibility had become my protection. I learned that being unseen was sometimes the only way to avoid conflict. Simple daily routines felt heavy. I waited for others to finish using shared spaces before stepping out. I timed my meals carefully, often eating alone, because the silence at the table felt sharper than hunger. Conversations happened around me about decisions that affected my life, but my opinions were no longer invited. When I tried to speak once, my words were brushed aside so quickly that I felt embarrassed for even trying. The fear was not always tied to words or actions. Sometimes it was in the tone of a voice, the way a door closed, the sudden shift in energy when I entered a room. These moments taught me to stay alert, to predict moods, to adjust myself constantly. Living this way was exhausting. It drained me physically and emotionally, leaving me weaker with each passing day. My health began to suffer in ways I could no longer hide. Pain followed me everywhere, my back, my legs, my joints. There were moments when standing felt impossible. I worried about falling, about needing help, about becoming even more of a burden. The thought terrified me. Asking for help felt dangerous, as if it would confirm every unspoken complaint about me. At night, sleep abandoned me. My mind replayed every conversation, every expression, searching for mistakes I might have made. I blamed myself constantly. If only I were quieter. If only I were easier to live with. If only I needed less. That kind of thinking slowly eats away at your sense of worth, until you begin to believe that your needs are unreasonable. I thought often about the attorney's words about safety and options. They felt distant, almost unreal compared to the immediate fear I lived with every day. Leaving still felt impossible. Where would I go? How would I manage? At my age, the world felt large and unforgiving. Staying felt familiar, even if it was painful. And familiarity has a way of disguising danger. But deep inside me, something had begun to shift. I could feel it in the way my chest tightened at certain moments, in the way my body reacted before my mind could explain why. This fear was no longer something I could explain away or endure quietly. It was a warning. For the first time, I allowed myself to acknowledge a truth I had been avoiding. Love should not make you afraid. A home should not feel like a place you need to survive. And if staying meant continuing to live in fear, then perhaps the real danger was not leaving, but remaining silent. By the time I accepted that fear had taken root in my life, it was already shaping every part of my day. I woke up each morning with my body tense, my mind racing before my feet even touched the floor. The house was quiet, but that quiet no longer felt calm. It felt watchful. I listened carefully before opening my door, trying to sense the mood of the day ahead. I had learned through painful experience that moods mattered more than words. A single wrong moment could turn the entire day heavy. I stopped doing things I once enjoyed. I no longer lingered in shared spaces or watched television in the living room. I avoided asking questions, even when I was confused or unwell. Needing clarity felt risky. Needing help felt even worse. I had trained myself to need as little as possible, believing that shrinking myself would keep the peace. But peace never came, only exhaustion. What hurt most was how alone I felt while surrounded by people. Voices filled the house, plans were made, laughter echoed at times, but none of it included me. I felt like furniture, something always there but never noticed unless it was in the way. That kind of loneliness is different from being alone. It makes you question your worth, your memories, your entire life. My health continued to decline quietly. Pain followed me everywhere, and fatigue wrapped around me like a heavy coat I could never take off. Some days I felt dizzy just standing up. I worried constantly about falling, about becoming helpless, about what would happen if something went wrong and no one took me seriously. That fear stayed with me day and night. It whispered that I was vulnerable in a place where vulnerability was not safe. I began doubting my own thoughts. Was I imagining things? Was I being dramatic? Years of silence had trained me to distrust myself. Even when fear screamed inside me, I questioned whether I had the right to feel it. That confusion was almost worse than the fear itself. When you stop trusting your own instincts, you become trapped. At night, sleep brought no relief. I lay awake replaying my life, wondering where everything had gone wrong. I remembered the woman I used to be, strong, capable, confident. I wondered how she had disappeared so completely. Somewhere along the way, I had confused love with endurance and patience with self-erasure. The truth was painful but undeniable. I was not living, I was surviving. And survival, when it lasts too long, begins to feel like a slow loss of self. I didn't yet know how or when things would change, but deep inside me, a quiet realization was forming. This fear was not something I could ignore anymore. It was asking me to choose. Continue disappearing or finally protect myself. That choice loomed over me, heavy and terrifying, and I knew that once I faced it, nothing would ever be the same again. There comes a time when even the strongest habit of staying quiet begins to crack, and I reached that moment without planning it. It wasn't a sudden burst of anger or a dramatic confrontation. It was exhaustion. Pure bone-deep exhaustion from carrying fear every single day. My body was already weak, but my spirit was even more tired. I could feel it in the way my hands shook more often, in the way my heart raced over the smallest things. Living on edge had slowly drained everything I had left. One evening after a particularly long, intense day, I felt something inside me shift. My pain was worse than usual, my legs felt unsteady, and my chest felt tight. I realized I could no longer pretend I was fine. I needed to speak, not to accuse, not to argue, but simply to be honest. I rehearsed my words in my head again and again, softening them, removing anything that might sound like blame. I only wanted understanding. I only wanted to be heard. When I finally spoke, my voice was quiet, almost trembling. I said I was struggling. I said I felt afraid. I said I needed a little kindness, a little patience. For a brief moment there was silence. And in that silence I felt a fragile hope rise inside me. I believed, foolishly perhaps, that honesty might change something. But instead of understanding, I was met with irritation. My feelings were dismissed as exaggeration. I was told I was too sensitive, that I was creating problems where none existed. Gratitude was thrown at me like a shield, reminding me of what I had, instead of listening to what I was losing. In that moment I understood something deeply painful. My pain was inconvenient. The tension in the room grew heavy, suffocating. My heart pounded so loudly I could hear it in my ears. I felt dizzy, overwhelmed, and suddenly very weak. I tried to step away, to return to my room, but my body failed me. My legs gave out beneath me and I fell hard to the ground. The pain was sharp and immediate, but what hurt more was the shock, the realization that this was happening in my own child's home. As I lay there, voices changed from frustration to panic. Someone rushed toward me. Someone called for help. But as I stared up at the ceiling, tears filling my eyes, a painful clarity washed over me. This was not just emotional neglect anymore. This was danger. Staying silent had not protected me, it had brought me here. In that moment, lying helpless on the floor, I finally accepted a truth I had been avoiding for far too long. Love should not make you afraid. A home should not make you feel unsafe. And a mother should never have to earn the right to be treated with dignity. That fall did not just injure my body. It shattered the last illusion I was holding on to. I could no longer stay quiet. I could no longer pretend that patience alone would fix this. Something had to change, and deep inside I knew that change would come at a cost I was finally ready to face. The days after that fall passed slowly, each one heavy with pain and realization. My body ached constantly, every movement reminding me how fragile I had become. Bruises faded, but the fear did not. The house felt different now, smaller, tighter, filled with an unspoken awareness of what had happened. Voices were softer, movements more careful, as if gentleness could erase the truth that had finally revealed itself. Apologies were offered, but they felt incomplete, carefully shaped to calm the moment rather than understand the damage beneath it. I listened quietly, no longer searching for reassurance. Something inside me had settled into clarity. I understood that what I needed could not be given here. Not safety, not peace, not respect. Staying would only return me to the same silence that had almost broken me. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a life beyond this house, and that thought both terrified and relieved me. Leaving felt impossible. I had spent my entire life believing that a mother's place was with her family, no matter the cost. Walking away felt like failure, like betrayal of everything I had lived for. But another truth stood beside that fear, steady and undeniable. Staying meant risking myself completely. I had already lost my voice, my comfort, and my sense of worth. If I stayed, what would be left of me? At night, sleep refused to come. I lay awake listening to the house settle into silence, my mind replaying years of memories. I remembered my children when they were young, the promises I made to protect them, the love I gave without condition. I never imagined that one day I would need to protect myself from the very place I built for them. That realization hurt more than any injury I carried. The decision to leave did not arrive suddenly. It formed slowly, built from exhaustion, fear, and the growing understanding that endurance was no longer strength. It was self-destruction. Choosing myself felt wrong after a lifetime of sacrifice. Yet deep inside, I knew this choice was not about anger or punishment. It was about survival. I cried quietly as I accepted what I needed to do. Not loud, desperate tears, but deep, grieving ones. I was mourning the family I thought I had, the future I believed was guaranteed. Letting go of that dream felt like losing a part of myself. But holding on to it would have cost me everything. In the silence of my room, I made my decision. I would leave. Not to prove a point, not to seek revenge, but to protect the fragile life I still had. That decision frightened me more than anything else I had ever faced. Yet for the first time in a long while, beneath the fear, I felt something else: resolve. The day I finally decided to leave, I moved through the house quietly, almost gently, as if I didn't want to disturb the fragile calm that had settled after everything that happened. There were no raised voices, no dramatic confrontations, no explanations. I no longer had the strength to argue or defend myself. Some truths do not need to be spoken aloud. They are already understood by the weight they leave behind. I packed slowly, choosing only what was necessary, my hands trembling not from doubt, but from the finality of the moment. Each item I picked up carried memories that pressed heavily on my heart. A scarf I once wore while waiting for my children at school. Old photographs tucked into a drawer. Small, ordinary objects that held years of love and sacrifice. Letting them go felt like letting go of entire chapters of my life. But I reminded myself that memories live inside us, not in things. What I truly needed could not be packed into a bag. Before leaving, I walked through the house one last time. I paused in doorways, touching the walls lightly, remembering the laughter that once filled these rooms. This place had been my world for so long. Now it felt like a place I had outgrown, not because I wanted to, but because it had stopped being safe. That realization hurt deeply. Yet it also brought a strange sense of peace. Stepping outside was terrifying. The air felt colder, sharper, as if the world was testing my resolve. I had no clear plan, no certainty about where I would go or how I would manage. At my age, starting over felt overwhelming. But staying had already shown me what it would cost. The unknown ahead felt frightening, but it did not feel dangerous, and that difference mattered more than I could explain. The first days away were disorienting. I felt uprooted, unsure of where I belonged. Guilt followed me everywhere, whispering that I had failed as a mother, that I had abandoned my role. Those thoughts cut deep, because they echoed beliefs I had carried my entire life. Yet each time guilt tried to pull me back, I reminded myself why I left. Not out of anger, but out of necessity. My body needed time to heal, and so did my mind. I moved slowly, carefully, learning once again how to trust my surroundings. Simple things felt unfamiliar. Sleeping in a new space, eating alone, listening to silence that was no longer filled with fear. There was loneliness, yes, but there was also relief. For the first time in years, no one made me feel like a burden for existing. I had left with very little. No certainty, no comfort, no guarantees. But I carried something far more important than anything I left behind. I carried my dignity. And as fragile as I felt, I knew that dignity would be the foundation on which I would rebuild my life. The days that followed were quiet in a way I had never experienced before. Not the tense, watchful silence I had grown used to, but a softer kind of quiet, one that allowed me to breathe. At first, the stillness felt unsettling. My body was so used to being on alert that peace almost felt wrong. I kept expecting something to happen, some voice to break the calm, some sudden shift that would send fear rushing back into my chest. But nothing did. And slowly I began to understand that this was what safety felt like. Without constant fear shaping my behavior, I started noticing how deeply it had controlled me for years. Simple choices, what time to wake up, when to eat, how long to sit in one place, had once felt dangerous. Now they were mine to make. That freedom felt strange, almost uncomfortable, but also empowering. I realized how much of myself I had given up without even noticing. Guilt still visited me often. It arrived quietly, wrapped in memories of my children when they were young. When my presence meant comfort and security, I questioned myself again and again. Was I wrong to leave? Should a mother endure everything? Those thoughts cut deeply, because they came from a lifetime of believing that love meant self-sacrifice without limits. But with time, another understanding began to grow. Sacrifice without safety is not love. It is loss. My body began to respond to the absence of fear. The constant tension eased. My sleep improved, even if it was still light and fragile. I felt moments of calm I had forgotten were possible. Healing, I learned, does not come all at once. It arrives quietly in small, almost invisible changes. A deeper breath. A relaxed shoulder. A moment without anxiety. I started to rebuild my sense of self in gentle ways. I allowed myself to rest without guilt. I listened to music. I spent time reflecting not on what I should have done differently but on what I needed now. For the first time in a long while, I treated myself with the kindness I had always given others. Some relationships remained distant, marked by silence and unresolved pain. I no longer chased explanations or apologies. I had learned that waiting for others to understand your pain can keep you trapped. Closure, I realized, is something you sometimes give yourself when others are unwilling or unable to change. I began to see myself not just as a mother defined by sacrifice, but as a woman who had survived something deeply painful. That shift changed everything. I was no longer ashamed of choosing myself. I was proud of it. The fear that once ruled my life had lost its power, and in its place, something stronger was growing: self-respect. I did not know what the future held, and that uncertainty still scared me at times. But it no longer controlled me. I had faced my deepest fear, being alone, and discovered that it was far less frightening than losing myself. And with that realization, I finally began to believe that my life, even now, still belonged to me. For a long time, I believed peace meant holding everything together, no matter how much it hurt. I believed that a mother's duty was to endure, to stay silent, to place everyone else's needs above her own. Walking away from that belief was the hardest thing I have ever done. But as time passed, I began to understand a truth that changed everything. Peace does not come from sacrifice alone. It comes from self-respect. Life after leaving did not suddenly become easy or joyful. There were still days filled with loneliness and moments when grief returned without warning. I mourned the family I thought I would grow old with, the home that was supposed to protect me. Letting go of those dreams felt like losing a part of myself. But I also learned that holding on to a dream that causes pain only deepens the wound. Accepting reality, as painful as it was, allowed me to move forward. I stopped waiting for apologies or understanding that might never come. I realized that my healing could not depend on anyone else's actions. Closure, I learned, is not something you are given, it is something you choose. I chose to release the anger that weighed me down, not to excuse what happened, but to free myself from carrying it any longer. Forgiveness became a quiet decision, made for my own peace, not for reconciliation. Slowly, I began to imagine a future shaped by my own choices. A life where my days were not governed by fear or guilt. A life where love, if it existed, would be gentle and respectful. And if it did not, I knew I would still be enough. That realization brought a strength I had never known before. I no longer measured my worth by how much I could endure. I measured it by how kindly I treated myself. I learned that boundaries are not acts of cruelty. They are acts of survival. And survival, when paired with dignity, becomes something powerful. This was not the ending I once imagined for my life. It was quieter, lonelier, and far more honest. But it was mine. And in choosing peace, even if it meant standing alone, I reclaimed the most important thing I had lost along the way. I reclaimed myself.